Welcome to this evening's journey with me. Tonight, imagine yourself standing atop the timeline of history, gazing across ancient dynasties, fierce battlefields, and philosophies that reshape the destiny of our world. We're about to meet 5 kings, not just rulers of nations, but architects of entire civilizations, from Alexander the Great, who spread the light of Greek culture across Asia and Europe, to Qin Shi Huang, who forged the political system that shaped China for over 2,000 years. From the galloping horsemen of Genghis Khan, bridging east and west, to the Napoleonic Code, which still influences the laws of over 70 countries, and finally, Ashoka, who transformed from a ruthless conqueror into the great messenger of Buddhism across Asia. These are not just kings, these are the men who built the world we live in. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It's always fascinating to see people from all over the world coming together in this moment. Now then, turn off the lights, let the fan hum quietly, put on your headphones. In just a few seconds, your screen will gradually fade to black, not because of a glitch, but because artificial blue light at night suppresses melatonin, the hormone your brain needs to relax and sleep well. When darkness sets in, imagination lights up. So let me take you through 5 empires, 5 men, 5 eras, and maybe, just maybe, one of them will change the way you see the world today. If you think military genius is something that just bursts into existence like lightning on a clear day, then you've never met Philip II, the kind of father who didn't raise his son with lullabies but with swords, books, and political trauma. Alexander was born in 356 BCE in Pella, the not-so-peaceful capital of Macedonia, from the start. He was never just a kid, not because he had 3 heads, or could solve equations faster than an abacus, but because he was the product of a legendary king and a mother who confidently believed she had hooked up with Zeus. Olympias, his mom, didn't just raise a child with affection, she raised him with divine PR. Legend says that the night he was conceived, she dreamt of a lightning bolt striking her womb. Dramatic, yes, but oddly fitting for someone who would go on to light the ancient world on fire figuratively and sometimes literally. At age 13, Alexander got a new tutor. Not just anyone, Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle, creator of formal logic, biological classification systems, and now the man responsible for getting a teenage warhead to sit still long enough to study metaphysics. Against all odds, they clicked. Aristotle taught Alexander everything: medicine, philosophy, poetry, geography, and most importantly, how to raise your chin when stepping over a map of the known world. Alexander didn't just absorb facts, he devoured them. He believed he was born for greatness, and nothing was greater than understanding the world, so you could conquer it. Soon, the boy could quote Homer mid-sword fight, debate ethics while hurling spears, and philosophize about existence moments before slamming you into the ground during a wrestling match. Knowledge wasn't decoration to Alexander, it was weaponized. When your teachers include Aristotle, your dinner guests are queen mothers, and your trainers are hardened veterans, you don't grow up to become an office clerk. You grow up to be a mobile catastrophe with organization, a conqueror armed with scrolls, divine delusions, and a sword honed by logic. When Philip II was assassinated in 336 BCE, Alexander was just 20. Power didn't politely knock it barged in like a Greek wedding loud, messy, and leaving no one unshaken. The Macedonians weren't sure whether to call him your majesty or that kid who just got rid of his acne. Alexander responded like a pro-cleaned house politically, eliminated threats faster than a Twitter block list, and crushed rebellions like they were training exercises. Then he turned east toward Persia. The largest empire in the known world sat smugly, assuming no one would dare kick its golden gates. Spoiler, Alexander didn't just knock, he broke the hinges. The Battle of Granicus was his grand introduction. King Darius III of Persia thought he was dealing with an overconfident child leading a hiking group. He miscalculated. Badly. Granicus, a modest river, became the first blood-soaked stage of Alexander's first date with destiny. His generals wanted to wait. Alexander said, "Nah." Why hold back when you can start the show by charging cavalry straight through a river into enemy cavalry like it's a wet obstacle course sponsored by Chaos Inc.? The Persians were caught off guard, General Memnon almost shouted. Cut, I wasn't ready. But Alexander wasn't shooting a movie. He was directing a massacre. Macedonian phalanx pushed forward like hydraulic justice. Cavalry swept flanks, and Alexander personally skewered a Persian commander just to keep things personal. After a few hours of mud, blood, and war horses screaming at gravity, Granicus was his. This wasn't just a win, it was a message carved in bronze. I'm here for your empire, and I don't stop to ask directions. Persia. They realised the nightmare had just begun. Alexander. He had only warmed up. In 333 BCE, Alexander didn't just step into history, he kicked down its doors, flipped the furniture, and poured wine on the carpet. The Battle of Issus wasn't just a military engagement, it was a first date, and also a breakup between two cosmic egos, Alexander, the young Macedonian prodigy, and Darius III, the king of a vast empire desperately in need of a guidebook titled How Not to Embarrass Yourself on a Battlefield. Before the battle, Darius held every advantage. His army outnumbered Alexander's nearly 3-1. He knew the terrain, he had chariots, archers, and just enough heavily armoured troops to qualify as a walking bronze museum. Alexander, he had himself. A few thousand loyal soldiers, and the kind of confidence usually seen in people who've never lost anything except sleep. Darius chose Issus, a narrow plain, thinking he could squeeze the Greeks like toothpaste. Problem, he was fighting Alexander, who could weaponize terrain like a set designer on a budget, instead of being trapped. Alexander repositioned, reinforced his right flank with light infantry and cavalry, and said, essentially, let's punch him in the face. What followed was a symphony of tactical violence. The Macedonian phalanx advanced like a living machine shield, walls locked, spears jutting like the bristles of a very angry porcupine. Darius, seated safely in his gold-plated war chariot, a luxurious but highly impractical choice for emergency exits, began to perspire under his leopard print robes. The turning point came when Alexander, leading his elite companion cavalry, launched a full-speed charge directly at the Persian centre. He didn't flinch, he didn't pause, he made eye contact and went for the jugular. Darius panicked. His war chariot turned around, and so did most of his army. The King of Kings abandoned his royal household mother, wife, children, and most of his imperial pride like free samples at a marketplace. Alexander didn't gloat. He didn't humiliate the royal family. He treated them as guests or high-value hostages with perks. It was more than noble, it was psychological warfare in a tailored cloak. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was better at being Persian royalty than the Persians. Issus wasn't just a victory, it was a rebranding. Alexander was no longer just a dangerously gifted war nerd from Macedonia. He was a full-fledged imperial force, and Darius, he sent desperate letters offering peace treaties, ransom money, and half the empire. Alexander declined. History doesn't belong to those who accept half. It belongs to the ones who take the whole damn map. By 332 BCE, Alexander had steamrolled through Asia Minor like a divine lawnmower. So naturally, he looked south to Egypt. Why? Because every great conqueror needs a scenic backdrop, some sun, and an ancient civilization to casually take over before lunch. Egypt, under Persian control at the time, was more than willing to switch allegiances. After all, the Persians had a habit of treating local customs like suggestions, so when Alexander showed up charming, handsome, and notably not burning temples, the Egyptians basically said, "Yes, Pharaoh, please." Alexander's entry into Egypt wasn't a battle, it was a coronation without paperwork. The people welcomed him like a messiah with good cheekbones. Priests blessed him, oracles nodded, crops probably stood up straighter. Within weeks, he was proclaimed son of Amun, the Egyptian king of gods, and officially Pharaoh, which, to a kid raised believing he was the son of Zeus, felt like fate saying, "You rang." But Alexander didn't stop with just taking the throne. He started city planning. On the northern coast, near the Nile Delta, he ordered the construction of Alexandria, not just another town with statues, but a gleaming, gridded, Greek meets Egyptian superport destined to be the Wi-Fi hub of the ancient world. He laid out streets himself, like, literally, with flour, because nothing screams divine ruler like micromanaging urban zoning with baking supplies. Alexandria would go on to become a legendary centre of learning, culture, and commerce. But at that moment, it was mostly sand, vision, and one man's ambition crystallised into limestone. While Egypt basked in new leadership, Alexander took a detour to the Siwa oasis, not for the view, for the Oracle of Amun. He trekked through the desert for days just to ask one question: am I the son of God? The Oracle, being an ancient marketing genius, gave a vague yes. Maybe it was you are divine, maybe you have a divine right, or maybe the priest just wanted the guy with the sword to leave happy. Whatever the phrasing, Alexander heard you are literally a god. From that moment, a spark of divine delusion lit up behind his eyes. Conquest wasn't just ambition anymore, it was destiny. His enemies weren't just mortals, they were plot points. His soldiers, props in a cosmic drama where he played every lead. Egypt was conquered. A new city bore his name. And the voice of a god had confirmed what his mother always whispered: you're special, sweetie. Except now, special came with shrines, cities, and a crown. Ephesus was the trailer. Gaugamela was the blockbuster release. It was 331 BCE, and Darius III was done playing polite. This wasn't a skirmish, it was the battle. The one where kings bet their empires, armies stretched beyond the horizon, and the gods themselves probably asked for front row seats. Darius wasn't going to repeat the Issus mistake. He chose Gaugamela, a wide, flat field perfect for chariots, cavalry, and one last shot at dignity. He even ordered the ground cleared of bumps and rocks so his scythed war chariots wouldn't get stage fright. We're talking military landscaping here. That's how seriously he took this. Alexander, of course, showed up fashionably underdog, outnumbered at least 5-1. Darius had elephants, chariots, and troops from every corner of the empire. Alexander had discipline, phalanxes, and the absolute refusal to die dramatically. Guess which mattered more? The battle opened with noise, drums, horns, dust rising like an ancient apocalypse trailer. Darius launched his scythed chariots with all the subtlety of a Broadway finale. But Alexander's troops, they didn't flinch. They opened lanes, trapped the chariots like confused rhinos, and stabbed everything that moved. Meanwhile, Alexander executed a maneuver so bold it's still taught today the oblique advance. He angled his entire line to the right, dragging Darius's forces out of position, creating just enough of a gap in the centre, and then smashed through it like Zeus kicking down a barn door. The companion cavalry stormed in, straight at Darius, and like at Issus, the King of Kings got spooked. His royal entourage begged him to flee, so he did again, only this time, he didn't just leave his family, he left the empire. Gaugamela wasn't just a victory, it was the disintegration of Persia in real time. Babylon opened its gates to Alexander, then Susa, then Persepolis the crown jewel, torched in a fit of symbolic drama that historians still argue was either revenge, accident, or wine-fueled overconfidence. Darius fled into the mountains, betrayed by his own satraps, and later found stabbed in the back, literally. Alexander, arriving too late to save him, gave him a royal funeral anyway, because why not claim your enemy's moral high ground after taking his empire? With Persia's crown on his head and its palaces behind him, Alexander wasn't just a conqueror anymore, he was the empire by 327 BCE. Alexander had conquered the known world, or at least everything that knew it was being conquered. Persia had fallen, cities bore his name, statues of him were probably winking at people in at least 3 languages. But was he done? Please. This was Alexander. He looked east and saw not the end of conquest, but unfinished business. India. He crossed the Hindu Kush with a veteran army, battle-hardened and absolutely not thrilled to meet more exotic climates, snakes the size of existential dread, and kings who bathed in gold and war elephants, especially the war elephants. Enter King Porus, ruler of the region near the Hydaspes River, a giant of a man, literally 7 feet tall, reportedly, and seated on an elephant that looked like it had opinions. Porus didn't surrender, he didn't grovel. He stood his ground and said, "Let's fight." And so they did under monsoon skies, in a muddy chessboard of carnage. Alexander, to his credit, didn't flinch. He outmaneuvered the elephants, flanked Porus's forces in a classic pincer, and after hours of chaos, emerged victorious, but he didn't gloat when asked how Porus should be treated. Alexander simply said, "As a king, respect given, respect earned." He even gave Porus back his territory because apparently, after you beat someone that badass, the only thing left to do is shake his hand. But something shifted after Hydaspes. The victories felt heavier, the men tired, the rain never stopped. Alexander wanted to push farther east, perhaps to the edge of the world. His army, however, mutinied at the river Hyphasis. They were done. No more jungles, no more gods whispering through oracles, no more philosophical speeches in the middle of snake-infested marches. Alexander raged. He begged. He sulked. He sacrificed to the gods, but the army wouldn't budge, and for the first time, Alexander turned back not defeated by an enemy, but by exhaustion, rain, and the hard limits of human ambition. The return journey through the Gedrosian desert was punishment, not by design, by hubris, blazing heat, dehydration, starvation. Thousands died. It was as if the gods whispered, "Oh, you wanted limits. Here's a furnace." By the time Alexander reached Babylon, he wasn't just a conqueror anymore. He was a man aging in fast forward. His dreams had stretched too far. The map, finally, said no. But that wasn't the end. The end came quietly. Next is death and what happens when a man who conquered everything has nowhere left to go. Babylon, 323 BCE. The empire stretched from Greece to India. Alexander had no equals, few friends, and an army that had marched past the limits of sanity. So naturally, he started planning his next conquest, Arabia, because why not sleep was for people without a messianic complex. Then suddenly, he fell ill. The accounts are fuzzy, vague, and suspicious. Fever, pain, weakness. Some say it was malaria, others poison, or maybe his own body just finally filed for resignation after a decade of non-stop ambition. He deteriorated over days, drifting in and out of consciousness while generals wept and scribes panicked. On his deathbed, someone asked, "To whom do you leave the empire, Alexander?" in true dramatic fashion, supposedly whispered to the strongest, which, if accurate, was less a succession plan and more a live grenade tossed into the throne room. And just like that, the man who never lost a battle lost the one against death. He was 32, barely old enough to run for Senate today. But what he left behind wasn't just an empire. It was a revolution. Alexander didn't just conquer, he Hellenized. His campaign scattered Greek culture like confetti across the ancient world philosophy. Language, architecture, coinage, drama, gym memberships. Cities named Alexandria popped up like chain restaurants, with the original in Egypt becoming the Starbucks reserve of knowledge. Trade boomed, ideas travelled, gods merged. Greek became the lingua franca from Egypt to Bactria. His former generals carved up his empire like a wedding cake, squabbling over the icing, but the cultural momentum never stopped. And that's the thing Alexander wanted to be remembered as a god. He ended up being something rarer, a cultural atom bomb. The blast didn't end with his funeral pyre, it echoed for centuries. So, was he a hero, a tyrant, a visionary with a sword and a mother complex? The answer is yes, all of it. Alexander died without leaving an heir, or perhaps he was the heir. to every king's fantasy that one life could ripple through history so hard that the world would never be the same again. And in that, he didn't just succeed, he rewrote the blueprint before China was China. It was a reality show called The Warring States, 7 kingdoms, endless betrayals, alliances that lasted 3 episodes, and enough backstabbing to qualify as a family tradition. Enter Qin Shi Huang, born Yingzheng, a man who looked at all that chaos and thought, I'll take the whole thing. He wasn't born an emperor, he made himself one. Ascending the Qin throne at just 13, Yingzheng was technically a boy king, but with the temperament of someone who'd already decided where to put the statues of his enemies. Early on, he trusted no one, not his mother, not her lovers, not even his own advisors, which turned out to be fair because they were all plotting. By his 20s, he'd cleaned house violently. Assassination attempts survived them. Internal corruption purged it. Political rivals silenced or recycled into bricks, with the Qin kingdom's brutal efficiency and terrifying army. He began swallowing up the other states like a board game speedrun. His strategy wasn't subtle. He didn't woo, he didn't debate, he invaded. Han fell first, then Zhao, then Yan, Wei, and Chu, each with their own, oh no, his serious moment as the Qin armies rolled through with crossbows, iron discipline, and psychological warfare that would make even the Mongols take notes. By 221 BCE, it was done. Yingzheng stood atop a unified land and declared a new title for himself, Qin Shi Huang, first emperor of Qin, not king, not warlord, emperor. Because if you're going to rename the entire country after yourself, might as well go all the way. China wasn't just unified, it was standardized. One law, one script, one currency. Even the width of cart axles was regulated because in Qin's China, even your wagon had to obey the state. But beneath the glory was fear. Qin Shi Huang ruled not through charisma, but control. He believed peace came through silence, and he had no interest in public opinion unless it was shouting his name in worship. And yet, for all his harshness, he did what no one before him had done. He built a nation from a battleground, not with ideals, but with strategy and steel. Once the warring states were dust and the Qin banners flew unchallenged, Qin Shi Huang didn't sit back to admire the view. He didn't take a victory lap. He built a machine not of gears and steam, but of laws, fear, and administrative spreadsheets carved in stone. At the heart of it all, legalism. Forget Confucius and his let's all be nice and moral vibe. Legalism was more shut up, do your job, or lose your head. It wasn't about cultivating virtue, it was about order through terror, discipline through consequence. And Qin Shi Huang He ate that philosophy for breakfast, lunch, and mass execution planning sessions under his rule. Every citizen had a number, every action had a consequence. Laws weren't suggestions, they were blunt instruments. Farmers had quotas, soldiers had rankings, officials were monitored like prisoners with better wardrobes, and spies everywhere. The Qin bureaucracy was so efficient. You couldn't sneeze without a report getting filed. Everything was standardized. Script, weights, coins, even axles. Why, so carts could roll smoothly on imperial roads. Yes, he unified the language and the highway system, because nothing says empire like forcing everyone to read your laws and then drive straight over them. But the real genius wasn't just the iron grip, it was the structure. The empire was carved into commanderies, each ruled by officials loyal not to local aristocrats, but directly to the throne. No more nobles with armies, no more hereditary fiefdoms, just centralized. Top-down governance where the only birthright that mattered was how terrified you were of the emperor. The people, meanwhile, were exhausted. But Qin Shi Huang didn't care about happiness. He cared about stability. To him, dissent was a crack in the foundation, and cracks got filled with concrete and corpses. Still, the machinery worked. Roads stretched for thousands of miles. Trade boomed. Walls were built. Culture homogenized. It was brutal. Yes, but effective. The Qin state became the most advanced bureaucratic war engine the ancient world had ever seen. It wasn't built to inspire. It was built to last. though ironically, it wouldn't. If Qin Shi Huang were alive today, he'd probably be that guy at a company who insists every email uses the exact same font, spacing, and subject line format or else. But instead of emails, he was unifying an entire civilization, and instead of passive-aggressive memos, he used imperial edicts and execution squads. After unifying China, the first emperor didn't stop at borders. He wanted unity in everything thought, language, weight, length, even axle width. That's right, axles. Because when your carts all fit the same ruts in the road, your armies move faster, your taxes arrive on time, and your citizens are less likely to veer off into rebellion. He standardised weights and measures down to absurd precision. Merchants had to recalibrate their scales. Carpenters had to learn new rulers. Anyone caught using the wrong inch faced fines. Jail. Or worse. And because the emperor believed fairness came from uniformity, he made sure even cheating was standardised. But the real stroke of control genius, the script. Before Qin, every region had its own version of Chinese characters like dialects of handwriting that only locals could read. That didn't sit well with a man who wanted his decrees to terrify the entire country simultaneously. So, he commissioned the small seal script, a uniform writing system that all officials had to use. No more regional squiggles, no more local flair, just one elegant, imperial alphabet to rule them all. It wasn't just literacy, it was linguistic colonization. Everyone, from bureaucrats to stone carvers, now spoke the emperor's visual language. This wasn't about convenience, it was about control. When everyone reads the same script, they read the same laws, when they measure with the same system, they pay the same taxes, and when they drive the same axle width, they drive down his roads. Even time became a tool. Qin Shi Huang imposed a centralized calendar one year, one emperor, one cosmic mandate. You didn't just live in his empire, you lived on his timeline. The result? A society so precisely engineered it made Sparta look like a hobby project. And sure, people grumbled, but not loudly, because under Qin rule, the only thing more dangerous than speaking out was measuring out of spec. If you ever feel overwhelmed by your to-do list, remember that Qin Shi Huang looked at a map of ancient China, saw its leaky northern border, and decided to build a wall across it. Not a fence, not a line of forts. A wall with a capital W and an attitude problem. The idea wasn't entirely new. Various states had built defensive walls before, but Qin did what Qin always did. He took the concept, multiplied it by 1,000, and weaponized it with bureaucracy. He didn't just order a wall, he ordered the Great Wall, an interconnected beast of stone, earth, and sheer audacity stretching thousands of kilometers to keep out nomads, raiders, and anyone else who wasn't invited to his totalitarian picnic. It wasn't one clean structure like you see in postcards. It was a stitched-together monstrosity built by soldiers, peasants, convicts, and probably anyone who complained about taxes too loudly. The project was brutal. Thousands died. The bodies were buried in the walls, at least according to legend. That's not just infrastructure. That's intimidation baked into architecture. But for Qin Shi Huang, the wall wasn't just defense, it was control by engineering. Each brick said this land is managed, each tower said this border is watched, and each conscripted labourer learned quickly that under Qin, every stone you laid was a reminder of who was in charge. But the wall wasn't the only thing he left behind in stone. Across the empire, he launched massive construction projects, roads wide enough for 6-horse chariots, canals connecting rivers that refused to cooperate, and palaces so vast they made the gods consider downsizing. And of course, beneath all that grandeur, he started building his own grave. But this wasn't a tomb. It was a subterranean empire, complete with rivers of mercury and an army of terracotta warriors so detailed you could check their shoelaces. Because when you control everything above ground, why not rule below it too? Qin Shi Huang built monuments like he built policies large, unyielding, and completely indifferent to how many people it crushed. But love him or fear him, his empire was no longer an idea. It was carved into the earth, and it was designed to outlive him, for a man who conquered death on the battlefield. Qin Shi Huang had a remarkably hard time accepting the kind that comes naturally as his empire grew. So did one question in his mind: how do I live forever? And instead of consulting philosophers, he turned to alchemists, sorcerers, and anyone willing to say yes, Your Majesty, with enough mercury on hand to make a thermometer sweat. Qin didn't want legacy. He wanted literal, physical immortality to rule the world forever, ideally without wrinkles. He dispatched fleets of ships to find the mythical Isles of Immortals, hoping to return with elixirs brewed by gods, or at least by enthusiastic frauds in fancy robes. And the Empire obliged. Sorcerers arrived with pills, potions, and scrolls full of symbols that meant absolutely nothing. One even claimed to have found the secret, but tragically never returned from his immortality scouting mission, probably sipping coconuts on a beach somewhere, funded by imperial coin. Meanwhile, back in the palace, Qin's anti-death regimen involved swallowing mercury pills because apparently the logic was, what doesn't kill you might just preserve you in horrifying agony. Spoiler, it didn't work. But the paranoia, that worked perfectly. As Qin aged, he trusted no one. His food was tested, his palace corridors redesigned, his movements cloaked in secrecy. He changed sleep locations nightly, suspecting that even death might need a map to find him. And still, he kept building roads, laws, tombs. But the crown jewel was his mausoleum, a subterranean kingdom beneath a man-made mountain, guarded by thousands of terracotta warriors, rivers of liquid mercury, booby traps, and perhaps even a note saying, "Not dead yet." Check back later. Ironically, in chasing immortality, he ignored the one way most emperors achieved it, a peaceful succession. He never prepared for the afterlife in political terms, only architectural ones. When Qin Shi Huang finally died, likely poisoned by his own immortality pills, his court hid the news for weeks. His body rotted in the imperial carriage while the smell was masked with fish. Because nothing screams divine legacy like travelling incognito next to a pile of sea bass. In the end, the man who tried to live forever barely made it to the sequel. If Qin Shi Huang could unify roads, weights, and writing, why not unify thought too? That's the logic that led him boldly, irrationally, terrifyingly to declare war on the one thing harder to conquer than rival kingdoms. Ideas, to the first emperor. Opinions were dangerous, philosophers were hazardous, and books that didn't reinforce his regime, they weren't culture, they were kindling. So in 213 BCE, he launched one of history's most infamous intellectual purges, the Great Book Burning. All texts not aligned with legalism, the state's hardline ideology, were ordered destroyed. Confucian classics gone. Historical records that dared compare past rulers to the present one ashes. Poetry that wasn't about the glory of the Qin incinerated. The only books spared were manuals on medicine, agriculture, and fortune-telling. Because apparently even tyrants still want a good harvest and a lucky lottery number. But it didn't stop at books. When some scholars protested, Qin's chancellor Li Si advised him to silence them permanently. Result: over 460 Confucian scholars were buried alive. Yes, alive. The emperor didn't just want to erase alternative ideas, he wanted to mulch them. Why such obsession? Because Qin didn't just fear rebellion, he feared remembering. The past, to him, was a threat. Old dynasties inspired comparisons. Ancient heroes bred disloyalty. Wisdom, if unchecked, turned into criticism, and criticism, in Qin's empire, was treason in a nice hat, so he wiped the slate, not just to rule the present, but to own the past. And for a time, it worked. The empire grew eerily quiet. Dissent became a whisper. Education turned into memorizing state slogans with proper enunciation. The only voices left were echoes of imperial decree. But controlling ideas is like holding water in your fist. The tighter you grip, the more it slips. When Qin Shi Huang died, it wasn't thunder or dragons that marked his passing. It was the smell of rotting flesh and spoiled fish. His death was so terrifying to the court that they hid it. stuffing his carriage with barrels of salted seafood to mask the odour while rushing home to stage manage the future. Spoiler, it didn't work. The emperor left no strong heir, only a frightened, manipulated son, and a scheming advisor who thought the best way to maintain power was to pretend nothing had happened. Within months, the empire he spent a lifetime unifying began to unravel like a badly tied knot. Peasant rebellions erupted. Former nobles resurfaced like mould. The people, once silenced, found their voices and they were angry, starving, and done pretending to be grateful for Axel standardization. By 206 BCE, just 15 years after unification, the Qin dynasty collapsed in a spectacular implosion of betrayal, infighting, and full-scale rebellion. The dynasty that was supposed to last 10,000 years barely made it to kindergarten. But here's the twist while the Qin dynasty fell. Its blueprint endured. The next dynasty, the Han, took a look at the wreckage and said, "Okay, not like that, but also, yes, like that." They kept the centralized bureaucracy, the standardized scripts, the legal codes, the infrastructure. They threw out the book burning thankfully, softened the terror, and renamed the flavor of control. Qin Shi Huang had ruled like a blade. The Han would rule like a leash, and so the bones of the Qin system became the spine of China for the next 2 millennia. The idea that one emperor could rule a vast, diverse land with bureaucracy, law, and overwhelming authority didn't die with Qin, it went viral. Today, Chinese students still trace their written characters back to the Qin reforms. Roads built under his rule still shape trade routes, and buried beneath a hill in Shanxi, guarded by a silent army of terracotta soldiers, the emperor's tomb still waits unopened, untouched, and possibly filled with enough mercury to kill anyone curious enough to try. He didn't achieve immortality, but he got something better, legacy carved in stone. Before he was Genghis Khan, the terror of continents. He was just Temujin, a boy on the steppe, orphaned, starving, and politically radioactive. If destiny had a blueprint for global domination, it definitely started with survived betrayal, exile, and total obscurity. Temujin's father, a tribal chief, was poisoned by rivals when Temujin was just 9. His family was immediately cast out, left to fend for themselves with nothing but bones, dirt, and whatever they could trap. This wasn't a tough childhood. This was a prequel to vengeance. Young Temujin learned quickly that loyalty was rare, betrayal was normal, and trust had a short shelf life. He was captured, enslaved, escaped, recaptured, and escaped again. Each humiliation added to a quiet fire a belief that one day he would be the one tying knots, not hanging from them. What made him different wasn't brutality, it was vision. While most Mongol leaders were content raiding neighbours and arguing over horses, Temujin dreamed of unity, a single banner, one law, no more tribal chaos, just order, ruthless, fast, unstoppable order. He began by building alliances not just through blood, but through merit. Temujin promoted based on loyalty and talent, not noble birth. In a world obsessed with bloodlines, he weaponized competence. His warriors followed him not because of ancestry, but because he won battles, loyalty, and their respect. And then he rewrote the rules. He outlawed kidnapping women, a Mongol pastime at the time. He instituted military discipline. He enforced strict codes of conduct even between tribes. If you disobeyed orders, it didn't matter how many goats your father owned. You bled like everyone else. By the early 1200s, Temujin had conquered his rivals, outmaneuvered his enemies, and crushed those who thought he was still that starving orphan boy. In 1206, the Mongol nobles gathered and gave him a new name, Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The boy abandoned on the steppes had become the unifier of the Mongols, and he wasn't finished. He had a continent to burn. Genghis Khan didn't just win battles, he redefined war. While European knights were still polishing their swords and arguing about dinner etiquette, the Mongols were becoming the world's first high-speed death machine powered by horses, precision, and a deep understanding of human fear. His secret weapon wasn't numbers, It was organisation. Mongol armies were broken into units of 10, 100, 1,000 and 10,000. Each level had a commander who didn't just shout orders, they delivered hell with a logistics plan. Orders travelled faster than gossip. Mistakes weren't tolerated. Cowards executed. Heroes promoted regardless of bloodline. This wasn't a warband. It was a meritocracy on horseback. Their tactics were psychological warfare in motion. Feigned retreats lured enemies into traps. Ambushes came from directions no one expected. Entire cities fell before realizing they were under attack. While most armies relied on brute force, Genghis relied on anticipation, knowing what his enemies feared and then serving it to them with arrows. Speaking of arrows, Mongol archers were nightmare material. From horseback, at full gallop, they could hit targets while turning, dodging, and texting their battle group chat probably. Each warrior had multiple bows, hundreds of arrows, and a lifelong relationship with saddles. They could ride 100 miles a day. That's not a cavalry unit that's fast-moving doom with GPS. But the real masterpiece terror as policy. When Genghis captured a city, he often gave them a choice: submit and live, or resist and get erased from maps, stories, and probably dinner conversations for the next 300 years. Entire populations were massacred strategically, not for cruelty, but for reputation. After a few horror stories travelled ahead of his armies, many cities simply surrendered in advance. His use of terror wasn't rage, it was branding. He made horror a business model. If a city fell, survivors, if any, spread the legend, not just of a conqueror, but of a force of nature in human form. Genghis didn't fight wars. He designed them like puzzles meant to be solved with blood and geometry, and the world had never seen anything like it. In 1219, Genghis Khan looked west and saw the Khwarezmian Empire, a massive, glittering state stretching across Central Asia. It was wealthy, cultured, heavily fortified. But Genghis didn't see cities. He saw targets. Initially, he tried diplomacy, sent envoys, gifts, a message. Let's trade, not bleed. The Shah of Khwarezm responded by murdering the diplomats, shaving their heads, and sending their remains back in pieces. That was, to put it mildly, a mistake. Genghis didn't respond with rage. He responded with a masterclass in retribution. He mobilized an invasion so swift, so brutal, it made previous conquests look like warm-ups. He split his army into multiple columns, sending them on separate routes, some over deserts, some through mountains, all through your nightmares. The Khwarezmian generals expected a frontal assault. Instead, they got every assault. Cities fell like dominoes. Bukhara, Samarkand. Nishapur, once centres of trade and culture, became monuments to Mongol rage. Genghis used each siege to refine tactics, terrify defenders, and send a message. This is what happens when you kill my messengers. In Bukhara, he allegedly walked into the mosque and told the citizens, I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me. Subtle? No. Effective? Devastatingly. But he wasn't just burning cities. He was erasing leadership structures. Every noble, every resistance figure, every potential rival gone. Those who surrendered quickly were spared. Those who resisted were not just destroyed, they were demonstrated. And he didn't stop with land. He sent a detachment around the Caspian Sea to outflank Khwarezm, entirely attacking from behind. Through mountains no one thought passable, the Shah fled, then ran again and again. He died on a remote island in the Caspian, not by blade but by exhaustion, humiliation, and the realization that Genghis Khan had outplayed him at every level. The Khwarezmian Empire didn't just fall, it disintegrated. In less than 2 years, Genghis had taken a stable, powerful empire and turned it into an unrecognizable wasteland. Not for glory, not for gold, for vengeance. And the world took notice. Europe, in the early 13th century, was blissfully unaware that a storm was brewing beyond the steppes. Kings squabbled, knights jousted, peasants peasanted, and then hoofbeats. Not just horses, but thunder. precision, fury on 4 legs. The Mongols had arrived. It started subtly. A Mongol force, technically a reconnaissance mission, entered Eastern Europe to gather information. That's Mongol for, we're going to dismantle your entire understanding of warfare. The year was 1223. The place Kalka River, a coalition of Russian princes and Cuman allies tried to stand against a Mongol vanguard. They believed they had numbers, unity, maybe even divine support. What they had was wrong assumptions. The Mongols feigned retreat a classic move and lured the coalition into a full-speed chase across open terrain. Then, as scripted by horror, the trap snapped shut. The Mongols turned, encircled, and annihilated the coalition in a perfect pincer. The Russian princes were captured, forced to lie under wooden planks, and then Mongol victory feasts were held on top of them, execution by humiliation and compression. Europe barely understood what had happened. The Mongols vanished as quickly as they came, like a storm that leaves no thunder, just ruins. But that was just the prologue. Later campaigns under Genghis's successors pushed deeper into Poland, Hungary, the Balkans, and every time. The result was the same shock and collapse. Fortified cities burned, armies were outmaneuvered, castles became tombs. Western generals thought victory meant brute force. The Mongols brought strategy, communication networks, siege tech, and discipline that made Europe look like a rehearsal dinner with swords. And yet, this wasn't even Genghis's main focus. Europe was a side quest, a test run. But even as a secondary campaign, it shattered the myth of Western military dominance. The West realized something horrifying. They were not the center of the world. The world had shifted, and the man who shifted it rode a horse, drew perfect circles of encirclement, and carried fire in his eyes. Genghis Khan didn't just knock on Europe's door. He kicked it open, took inventory, and rode out promising to return. For a man who crushed cities, toppled empires, and made siege warfare look like a party trick, Genghis Khan had a shockingly progressive side. Once the screaming stopped and the dust settled, he didn't just rule with iron and arrows. He governed with something rarer in history's long list of conquerors: pragmatism. Genghis wasn't interested in forcing one religion, one culture, or one language. He had no time for theological debates. What he did care about was loyalty, stability, and taxes, preferably in that order. So when it came to religion, his policy was simple: worship whoever you want, just don't disobey me. His empire, spanning from China to Eastern Europe, included Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, Taoists, shamans, and people who probably just prayed to not get invaded. Genghis granted religious freedom across the board. He exempted clergy from taxation, protected temples, and even hosted interfaith councils, not because he loved diversity, but because tolerant subjects are quieter subjects. He even carried a personal squad of astrologers and shamans from multiple faiths, just in case one had better battlefield advice. But his brilliance didn't stop at tolerance. Genghis built systems. He established a Yam postal system relay stations every 25-30 miles stocked with fresh horses and supplies. Information flew across the empire faster than armies could march. This wasn't a communication network. It was an arterial system for empire-wide control. He created a legal code, the Yasa, combining tribal traditions with new laws. Theft, betrayal, and desertion punished harshly. Religious leaders and diplomats sacred. It was law by order and fear, but also by surprising fairness for a man who once burned entire cities off the map. He promoted literacy and census-taking, encouraged trade, standardized weights, appointed administrators not by nobility, but by competence. It didn't matter where you were born, what mattered was whether you could get things done. He didn't just conquer an empire, he ran it. And in doing so, he proved something few conquerors ever do. Destruction is easy. Administration is power. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer land, he connected it. And while swords built the empire, it was commerce that held it together. In a world where merchants were often treated like travelling nuisances, Genghis treated them like royalty with receipts. His empire wasn't just about war, it was about movement of goods, people, ideas. And at the centre of this global highway, the Silk Road, stretching from China to Europe. The Silk Road had existed for centuries, but it was often fragmented, risky, and as predictable as a tavern brawl. Bandits roamed free, borders shifted weekly, every caravan was a gamble. Then came Genghis. He cleaned house, he secured the routes, patrolled the roads, and established laws protecting merchants, in many cases. Those found robbing caravans were executed faster than you could say, spiced textiles. Trade wasn't just tolerated, it was sacred. He created passports, yes. Actual paper credentials that granted safe passage across regions. These weren't suggestions. Flashing one of Genghis's passports meant local officials had to provide supplies, lodging, and absolute respect, or face the wrath of a system that moved faster than karma. Taxes were collected, but fair. Markets boomed. Cities along trade routes blossomed like never before. From Samarkand to Xi'an, bazaars thrived. Silk moved west, silver flowed east, and with it came ideas, inventions, religions, medicine, and yes, plague. Eventually, but for a while. The Mongol Empire was the closest thing the medieval world had to globalization. A merchant from Venice could, in theory, travel all the way to Beijing under one banner safe, fast, and potentially very, very rich. Why did Genghis care? Because commerce meant information, alliances, and taxes, all of which were better than rebellion. When people trade, they're too busy counting profits to plot insurrections. So the warlord of the steppes became the guardian of caravans. The destroyer of cities became the protector of markets. And in doing so, Genghis Khan didn't just redraw maps, he rewired civilization itself. In 1227, Genghis Khan, the man who reshaped continents, died. The cause unclear. Some say it was a fall from his horse. Others whisper about battle wounds, assassination, or illness. And because Genghis was more legend than man, the Mongols kept it that way, a mystery wrapped in silence and sealed with terror. His death was so secret that the funeral procession reportedly killed everyone they passed to keep word from leaking. Then they killed the killers. Then they buried him in an unmarked grave, hidden in the hills of Mongolia, and drove 1,000 horses over it to erase all trace. Subtlety was not his empire's style. But here's the twist: Genghis Khan's death didn't stop the empire. It accelerated it. He had done what few conquerors ever managed, built a system that could survive him, before dying. He divided the empire among his sons and generals, not as a breakup, but a blueprint for expansion. Each son ruled a khanate, each had armies, and each carried the same message. Keep going, and they did, under his descendants. The Mongol Empire doubled in size. They overran Persia again. They captured Baghdad and burned its libraries. They swept into Eastern Europe, crushed Hungary and Poland, and reached the outskirts of Vienna. They ruled all of China under Kublai Khan and established the Yuan dynasty. By the late 1200s, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in history, from the Pacific to the Danube. One name still echoed: Genghis Khan. He had turned scattered tribes into a war machine, transformed chaos into order, replaced borders with banners, and even in death, he remained the gravitational force pulling the medieval world into a new alignment. His tomb may be lost. His empire may have fractured, but his influence, still riding. Before he was Emperor of the French, Nightmare of Europe, or short guy with long ambitions. Napoleon Bonaparte was just a moody Corsican kid with a chip on his shoulder and a French accent thick enough to butter bread. Born in 1769, shortly after France liberated Corsica by conquering it. Young Napoleon grew up resenting two things: the French, and not yet being in charge. His family was noble-ish, poorish, and deeply political by age 9. Napoleon was shipped off to mainland France to attend military school, a cultural transplant as subtle as duct taping a cannon to a violin recital. He didn't fit in. The other boys mocked his accent, his manners, and his volcanic temper. So Napoleon did what any future dictator would: he studied obsessively, plotted silently, and waited to outgrow everyone. He wasn't charming, He wasn't social, but he was a tactical savant with a photographic memory and an ego that required its own baggage cart. By the time the French Revolution exploded in 1789, Napoleon saw his chance. The old monarchy was gone, the world was upside down, and in chaos. Napoleon thrived. He began rising fast, not through birthright, but raw, brutal competence. While aristocratic generals were busy panicking or losing their heads, Napoleon was calculating artillery trajectories and reorganising armies like a man rearranging chess pieces mid-firefight. His first big break came in 1793 at Toulon, where royalists had seized a key port. Napoleon, then just a 24-year-old artillery officer, came up with a plan so effective it made his superiors look like toddlers holding muskets. Toulon fell. Napoleon rose. Then came Paris, 1795. Royalists again threatened the government. Napoleon, called in to help, greeted them with a whiff of grape-shot cannons fired directly into protesters. It was efficient, horrifying, and effective. By 26 he was a general. By 27 he was commanding armies in Italy, and Europe had no idea that the skinny Corsican with a twitchy eye and mathematical obsession would soon turn entire kingdoms into bullet points in his biography. By 1799, France was a revolutionary mess, starving, exhausted, and ruled by something called the Directory, which was 5 guys in wigs pretending to be a functioning government. Spoiler, they weren't. The people were angry, the politicians were panicking, and the only thing holding the country together was Napoleon's military victories and increasingly imperial swagger. And Napoleon, he smelled opportunity like a general smells weakness. Returning from his less than successful Egyptian campaign, Napoleon marched back into Paris not as a loser, but as a celebrated saviour. The press, conveniently controlled by his friends, painted him as France's only hope, which, in a way, he was, assuming your definition of hope includes dictatorship with flair. On November 9th, 1799, Napoleon launched a coup d'etat. He didn't need much force, just the illusion of authority and the panic of incompetence, with a mix of intimidation, paperwork, and some artful shouting in the right corridors. He dissolved the Directory and replaced it with a new system, the consulate. 3 consuls on paper, only one that mattered. By 1802, he declared himself first consul for life because temporary power is for amateurs. Then, in 1804, he took it one step further. With a crown forged from ambition and audacity, Napoleon had himself declared Emperor of the French, but he didn't let the Pope crown him. Oh no, he took the crown, walked up the steps of Notre Dame Cathedral, and placed it on his own head, in front of everyone, including the Pope, because Napoleon wasn't asking for divine right. He was announcing it. France, exhausted from revolution, monarchy, and chaos, applauded. Here, finally, was order, direction. A man who knew what he wanted and had the cannons to get it. The boy from Corsica was now Emperor of Europe's biggest power, and he was just getting started. For a guy who spent half his life on horseback turning Europe into a battlefield, Napoleon had a surprisingly sharp eye for domestic engineering. While the cannons roared, he was also redesigning France from the inside out, not just as a general, but as an architect of modern statehood. His greatest non-military weapon, the Napoleonic Code, introduced in 1804, it wasn't just a legal reform. It was a reset button for French law, clearing centuries of feudal clutter and replacing it with clarity, structure, and the kind of legal order bureaucrats have wet dreams about. Property rights, contracts, civil obligations all codified, equality before the law. Yes, freedom of religion affirmed, women's rights. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Spoiler, women still couldn't sign contracts or have full custody. Even a genius has blind spots. But the code's impact went global. Over 70 countries would eventually adopt versions of it. From Latin America to the Middle East, Napoleon didn't just conquer lands, he rewrote their legal DNA. And he didn't stop at law. Napoleon tackled education like a military campaign. He created the lycée system, state-run secondary schools that drilled knowledge into teenage minds with almost Prussian precision. Rote memorization, math, classical languages, it was intellectual boot camp. The idea train a generation of obedient, educated administrators who wouldn't need nobility to rule. Then came the University of France, not place, but a centralised body overseeing all education. Think national curriculum with a Napoleon-shaped signature at the bottom of every page. He reformed finance, establishing the Bank of France to stabilise the economy. He cleaned up taxation, built roads, modernised agriculture, and sprinkled in just enough censorship to keep critics quietly frustrated. All of it was top-down, centralised, and relentlessly efficient. Napoleon's France wasn't democratic. It was engineered a nation built like an army, where the goal wasn't freedom of expression but functionality at scale. And it worked. Even after his empire crumbled, the systems he built remained. You can still see their bones in modern France, in courtrooms, classrooms, and civil codes. Because while Napoleon's conquests burned fast, his reforms burned deep. Between 1803 and 1810, Napoleon wasn't just fighting wars, he was rearranging the furniture of Europe. Borders blurred, dynasties crumbled, maps became temporary sketches, and in the middle of it all stood one man, gripping power like a general grips a sabre, Napoleon Bonaparte. The wars, later called the Napoleonic Wars, weren't one big brawl. They were a chess game with cannonballs, fought across a dozen fronts, against coalitions that couldn't agree on much except that Napoleon was the problem. And Napoleon, he didn't just win. He orchestrated victories like symphonies of strategy. Take the Battle of Austerlitz. 1805. Napoleon's masterpiece. Facing Russian and Austrian forces nearly twice his size, he pulled off a tactical illusion so perfect it should have come with a magician's license. He feigned weakness, drew the enemy into a trap, and then annihilated their centre like a scalpel through empire. The result, Austria begged for peace. Russia backed off. Europe blinked. Then came Jena Auerstedt in 1806, where Napoleon's forces steamrolled Prussia in days, shattering their myth of invincibility and leaving their once proud army a footnote. By 1807, after Friedland, even Russia said, "Okay, maybe we talk." Napoleon met Tsar Alexander thus on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, and cut a deal that essentially split Europe into spheres of influence. France controlled the West, Russia took the East, Britain still resisting, but now very alone. At the height of his power, Napoleon controlled almost all of continental Europe either directly, through vassal states, or via puppet monarchs, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Westphalia, all Napoleonic makeovers. Even his siblings got thrones like party favours. Happy birthday, here's a kingdom. But it wasn't just military genius, it was momentum. Every victory built more morale, more loyalty, more legend. The French army became a machine, trained, mobile, fanatically loyal to the man they called the Little Corporal. And Napoleon, he stood atop the world smirking, calculating, unstoppable. But even meteors burn brightest before the crash, and his crash would be epic if Napoleon's rise was a rocket. The Peninsular War was the first sputter of the engine. On paper, it seemed simple. Spain and Portugal were weak, disorganised, and ripe for a French makeover. In reality, they were about to become Napoleon's bleeding ulcer, one he couldn't cauterise. In 1807, he convinced Spain to let French troops pass through en route to Portugal. But once inside, Napoleon pulled the oldie live here now trick. He deposed the Spanish king, installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne, and declared Spain a French client state. The Spanish people, however, had other ideas. They revolted, not with traditional armies, but with guerrilla warfare, a term that literally comes from guerra, Spanish for war. These weren't coordinated military campaigns. These were ambushes, assassinations, sabotage missions, 1,000 paper cuts with gunpowder. French troops, trained for open battles, were suddenly bogged down in towns, mountains, and alleyways where every civilian might be a killer. Supply lines collapsed, morale plummeted. The war, meant to last months, dragged on for 6 miserable years. Then came the British, led by Arthur Wellesley, soon to be Duke of Wellington. British forces landed in Portugal and began pushing back. They were disciplined, methodical, and annoyingly persistent. Unlike Napoleon's previous enemies, they learned from defeat. Meanwhile, Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother and accidental king, was about as charismatic as wet bread. He struggled to govern a population that wanted him dead, and a land where every road led to rebellion. The Peninsular War became a drain of troops, of resources, of reputation. For every city captured, 10 villages burned in resistance, and worst of all, it inspired hope across Europe. The myth of French invincibility cracked. Slowly, other nations began whispering, if Spain can resist. By overreaching, Napoleon exposed a flaw. He could win battles, but he couldn't hold a people who hated him. In 1812, Napoleon made a decision so bold, so massive, and ultimately so catastrophic that it became history's gold standard for biting off more than one can chew. He invaded Russia. Why? Because Tsar Alexander I had pulled out of the continental system Napoleon's attempt to economically starve Britain. To Napoleon, this was betrayal. To Russia, it was self-preservation. Either way, war was on. Napoleon assembled the Grande Armée over 600,000 troops, the largest force Europe had ever seen, a multicultural behemoth drawn from every corner of his empire. It was less an army, more a mobile civilization armed to the teeth. But Russia refused to play fair. Instead of fighting decisive battles, the Russians retreated. Every time Napoleon advanced, they pulled back burning fields, destroying supplies, and leaving nothing behind but empty land and smoking villages. It wasn't war. It was a trap disguised as patience. Finally, at Borodino, Napoleon got his big fight. It was brutal, bloody, over 70,000 casualties, and though technically a French victory, it was Pyrrhic gains measured in meters, not momentum. Then came Moscow. Napoleon entered the city, expecting surrender. Instead, he found it empty. No dignitaries and no citizens, just silence and then fire. Russian partisans set the city ablaze. Napoleon stood in a burning ghost town, far from home, with winter approaching and no supplies. He waited. Tsar Alexander didn't come. He waited longer. Still nothing. So, in October, with snow creeping in and morale collapsing, Napoleon gave the order. Retreat. But the retreat wasn't orderly. It was apocalyptic. Russian winter descended like vengeance. Temperatures plummeted. Horses froze mid-stride. Soldiers starved, died, deserted. Russian forces harassed the flanks. Frostbite killed more than bullets. Of the 600,000 who invaded, less than 100,000 returned. Napoleon's reputation, once invincible, was shattered. The Russian campaign didn't just cost him an army, it cost him his aura. After Russia, Napoleon's empire began to crack like old marble. The myth was gone, the aura shattered, and suddenly, all of Europe remembered. They hated this guy. In 1813, the Sixth Coalition Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, and a few countries Napoleon had previously rearranged formed a tag team. At Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, they brought over 600,000 troops to settle the score. Napoleon lost badly. Back in France, his grip weakened, allies deserted, political support evaporated. By 1814, coalition forces marched into Paris. Napoleon tried to rally, tried to bluff, but even his marshals were done playing imperial poker. On April 6, 1814, he abdicated. But Europe, unsure what to do with its favourite villain, chose a compromise. Exile to Elba, a tiny island off the coast of Italy. Napoleon was made ruler of this glorified rock, complete with a palace, a guard of 600 men, and enough boredom to drive a conqueror insane. He lasted 10 months. Then he escaped. In March 1815, Napoleon landed back in France with a small force. As he marched north, soldiers sent to arrest him joined him. His charisma hadn't faded. The moment he said, "If you would shoot your emperor, do it now," they dropped their rifles and cheered. Within weeks, Napoleon was back in Paris. King Louis XVI fled, and just like that, Napoleon was emperor again. The 100 Days had begun. Europe, stunned, scrambled, old alliances reformed, armies mobilised. This wasn't just a comeback. It was a final act, and it would end on a field called Waterloo, June 18th, 1815, a field in Belgium, rain-soaked, mud-caked, and about to become one of the most decisive days in world history. Napoleon's last gamble had begun. His plan hit the Allies led by the Duke of Wellington before they could unite with Prussian forces under Blucher, break them fast, force a treaty, reclaim Europe. It could have worked. But Waterloo wasn't just a battle. It was a perfect storm of bad timing, worse luck, and one empire gasping its final breath. Rain delayed his cannons, mud slowed his troops, and the battlefield hills, hedges, fortified farms favoured defence. Wellington dug in, waited, and held. Napoleon launched assault after assault. French cavalry charged uphill into musket fire. Infantry clashed with British lines at Hougoumont. La Haye Sainte names that would echo in military textbooks for centuries. Still, Napoleon believed he could win, until the Prussians arrived. From the east, Blucher's army surged onto the field. Napoleon's right flank collapsed. Reserves were gone, morale shattered, and the final charge by the Imperial Guard, his elite, his legends, was repulsed. That had never happened before. Soldiers shouted, "La Garde recule." The Guard retreats. Panic spread, the army disintegrated, Napoleon fled. Waterloo wasn't just a defeat. It was the death of the dream, the idea that one man could bend Europe to his will by sheer force, vision, and audacity. Days later, Napoleon abdicated again. This time, there was no Elba, no comeback. The Allies packed him off to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, a prison of ocean, wind, and memories. And there, far from the maps he had redrawn, Napoleon watched the world move on. His empire was gone, but the legend just getting started. Napoleon Bonaparte, once ruler of Europe, master of armies, crowned by no one but himself, spent his final years in loneliness and wind. St. Helena, his new home, wasn't an island, it was a sentence, located in the middle of the South Atlantic. It was remote, storm-lashed, and populated with more goats than glory. No fanfare, no court, just guards, British suspicion, and a sprawling emptiness that mirrored his fall. He lived in a damp estate called Longwood House, where the wallpaper peeled like dignity and the food was a daily insult. The British kept him under tight surveillance, terrified he might escape again. He wouldn't. So he walked. He dictated memoirs, rewrote history, told his version of the empire to anyone who would listen or write it down. Even in exile, Napoleon knew one thing. Conquerors fade, legends echo. By 1821, his health was failing, likely from stomach cancer. Though theories of slow poisoning still swirl, on May 5th, with rain tapping on the windows and the world far away, Napoleon died. His final words. France, the army, head of the army, and then silence. He was buried on the island. No fanfare, no empire, just 6 loyal men, a simple grave, and a legacy already blooming in marble and myth. But time, as always, rewrote the ending. In 1840, his body was returned to France. A funeral procession wound through Paris, and his remains were placed in a monumental tomb at Les Invalides, a hero's homecoming. Decades too late. Napoleon lost the world, but he gained immortality. Today, his laws still govern, his legend still inspires, his shadow stretches across history like a man too large for the century that tried to contain him. He died on a rock, but he lives in every empire ever dreamt by ambition. Before he was a symbol of peace. Ashoka was a prince born into fire and politics. He was the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, founder of the Mauryan Empire, and the son of Bindusara, a ruler with many wives, many sons, and one serious succession problem. Ashoka wasn't the eldest. He wasn't the heir. He was the warrior prince, brilliant in strategy, terrifying in battle, and deeply unpopular with his stepbrothers. To consolidate power, Ashoka was sent to suppress revolts. He crushed them, brutally, One city after another bowed or burned. His reputation grew. So did his ambition. When Bindusara died, a bloody power struggle erupted. Ashoka, unsurprisingly, one allegedly killing several of his brothers to claim the throne, in 268 BCE. He became emperor of the Mauryan Empire, the largest realm in Indian history up to that point. And yet, Ashoka wasn't done proving himself. In 261 BCE, he launched a campaign against Kalinga, a wealthy, independent kingdom on India's eastern coast, strategically vital, rich, proud, also fiercely unwilling to surrender. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles in ancient Indian history. Kalinga resisted with everything it had. Ashoka's army responded with overwhelming force. The rivers ran red, fields became graveyards, over 100,000 dead, thousands more deported, enslaved, left shattered. And then something broke. After the victory, Ashoka walked through the battlefield. He saw the corpses, the smoke, the families wailing, the land he now ruled soaked in grief. That moment changed him. He didn't see conquest. He saw karma. Ashoka began to question everything. His ambition, his violence, his legacy. The man who had once conquered cities by the sword now stood defeated by the consequences of his own victory. And so began one of the most dramatic transformations in world history. From Emperor of War to Emperor of Peace, the battlefield of Kalinga didn't just crush enemies, it shattered Ashoka's soul, haunted by the carnage he caused. The emperor turned inward, not to politics, not to conquest, but to Buddhism, a philosophy that promised not dominance, but liberation from suffering. He didn't convert in a temple or through scholars. He converted through remorse. Ashoka began studying the Dharma, not just intellectually, but as a blueprint for empire. He wasn't content to meditate in silence. He wanted to govern through compassion. He embraced non-violence, tolerance, and self-discipline not as ideals, but as policy. And just like that, the king who had once ruled with iron now ruled with principles. He outlawed animal sacrifice, built hospitals for both people and animals, planted trees, dug wells, and built rest stops along roads not for armies, but for pilgrims and travellers. His administration shifted. Governors were instructed not just to enforce law, but to practice moral instruction. Compassion wasn't just a virtue, it became imperial strategy. Ashoka dispatched Buddhist missionaries across India and beyond to Sri Lanka, Central Asia, even the Mediterranean, not with swords, but with words. His inscriptions on rocks, pillars, and caves were written in local dialects, making sure his message reached everyone, from nobles to villagers. But don't be fooled. Ashoka's peace wasn't passive. It was active governance. His edicts didn't call for retreat from power, they demanded responsible power. He used the full machinery of empire not for conquest, but for moral infrastructure. It was bold, radical, some say idealistic, but it worked. For a time, the Mauryan Empire became a rare thing in human history. An empire built not on fear, but on values. And Ashoka, he became more than emperor. He became conscience carved in stone. When most emperors wanted to broadcast their power, they built statues, minted coins, or named cities after themselves. Ashoka did something different. He carved his conscience into stone, across India and beyond. From the Himalayan foothills to the southern coasts, Ashoka erected rock edicts, inscriptions chiselled into cliffs, boulders, and polished pillars. These weren't declarations of conquest. They were messages to his people. Live with virtue, avoid cruelty, respect all faiths. Written in local languages including Prakrit, Greek, and Aramaic. These edicts were revolutionary. They weren't top-down decrees to impress elites. They were moral instructions intended for common people, monks, merchants, and travellers. The rocks didn't glorify Ashoka's power. They shared his doubts, his regrets, his hopes. This was Dharma diplomacy, a new kind of imperial messaging where kings didn't boast about battles, but confessed their past and vowed to be better. Ashoka apologised for Kalinga, publicly, in stone. No conqueror had ever done that. He used his authority not to dominate, but to spread ethical governance. He sent ambassadors to foreign lands not just to trade goods, but to trade values. The rulers of Egypt, Greece, and Sri Lanka received envoys from Ashoka carrying Buddhist texts, medicinal herbs, and messages of peace. Ashoka's cultural legacy grew far beyond politics. He supported monasteries, funded translation efforts, and helped establish Buddhism as a global force. Stupas, sculptures, and teachings radiated outward north to Central Asia, east to China, and south to Sri Lanka. And he never claimed divinity, only responsibility. Today, the Ashoka Chakra, a symbol from his edict, sits at the heart of India's national flag. His name is remembered not for the size of his empire, but for the weight of his transformation. Ashoka didn't just rule land, he ruled with intention, and in doing so, he carved not just rock, but history itself. Ashoka's twilight years were marked not by conquest, but by quiet resolve. After decades of rule, the emperor who had once wielded armies now focused on pilgrimage and reflection. He visited sacred Buddhist sites Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, Sarnath not to proclaim his power, but to honour the path he had chosen after Kalinga. He built monasteries, patronised monks, continued carving messages into stone not for glory, but for guidance. His rule became a kind of moral caretaking, less about expansion, more about preservation of values in a world that often forgot them. But Ashoka's softness became a vulnerability as he aged. Succession grew unclear. The once iron grip of Mauryan authority began to loosen. After Ashoka's death around 232 BCE, the empire slowly unravelled. Regional governors grew bold. Rebellions stirred. The central government weakened. By 185 BCE, less than 50 years after his death, the last Mauryan ruler was overthrown by a general. The Empire Ashoka had ruled the largest Indian state until the Mughals was gone. But legacy, that endured. Ashoka's edicts were forgotten for centuries, buried under jungle and dust, but when rediscovered in the 19th century, they reshaped the understanding of ancient Indian history. Here was a ruler who governed with conscience, who saw remorse not as weakness, but as awakening. He became a symbol for modern India. His lion capital is now the national emblem. His chakra adorns the flag. His commitment to peace, pluralism, and ethical rule continues to echo across textbooks, temples, and political speeches. And globally, Buddhism flourished not just as a religion, but as a cultural force that shaped Asia for millennia. Without Ashoka's sponsorship, it might have remained regional. With it, it became civilizational. Ashoka died a man, but he left the world something rarer. A ruler who proved that the sharpest legacy is not carved by sword, but by self-transformation. Markdown. In 1852, a baby was born in Kyoto, one who would dismantle centuries and drag Japan into modernity. His name Mutsuhito. History would remember him as Emperor Meiji. But when he was born, Japan was still frozen in time for over 250 years. The Tokugawa shogunate had ruled in the emperor's name, an iron grip wrapped in ritual. The emperor was symbolic, ceremonial, a divine figure trapped in golden silence while real power rested with the shoguns and their samurai enforcers. Then the West arrived. In 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry steamed into Edo Bay with black ships, cannons, and a message: open your ports, trade, or else. Japan, which had isolated itself for centuries, suddenly faced gunboat diplomacy and the terrifying reality of being technologically behind. The Tokugawa regime blinked. Unequal treaties followed. Foreigners entered. Humiliation simmered. The samurai class was furious. Commoners whispered about corruption. And the emperor was watching. In 1867, at just 14 years old, Mutsuhito ascended the throne as Emperor Meiji days later. The last Tokugawa shogun resigned, but it wasn't peaceful. Pro-imperial and pro-shogunate forces clashed in the Boshin War, a civil conflict fought with both swords and steamships. By 1869, the emperor's forces had won. The Tokugawa shogunate was gone. The capital moved from Kyoto to Edo, renamed Tokyo. The old world burned, the new one just beginning, and at the centre of it stood a teenage emperor with a quiet face and a mind ready to reshape a nation. The year was 1868. The Tokugawa shogunate had crumbled, and power was restored to the imperial throne. But this wasn't a return to ancient glory, it was a leap into the future. Japan wasn't going backward. It was about to reinvent itself. This transformation became known as the Meiji Restoration, a top-down revolution with one goal: modernize or perish. And behind the velvet curtain of imperial formality, the teenage Emperor Meiji emerged as a silent architect of an entirely new Japan. The first move: abolish the feudal system. The domains of the powerful daimyos were replaced with prefectures, governed by officials appointed by Tokyo, not inherited by lineage. Samurai lost their stipends. Their swords were banned. The warrior class, once rulers of Japan, were now bureaucrats, teachers, or unemployed. This wasn't reform. It was surgery. Then came the Charter Oath of 1868, a declaration of intent that promised deliberative assemblies, meritocracy, and the pursuit of knowledge. Meiji wasn't just opening the gates, he was tearing down the walls. The government was restructured into ministries: finance, education, justice, foreign affairs. A new constitution followed in 1889, modelled on Prussia's concentrating power in the emperor, while allowing for a parliament, the diet, and modern bureaucracy. But the brilliance of the Meiji Restoration wasn't just imitation, it was adaptation. Japan absorbed Western systems without losing its soul. It kept the emperor at the centre, not as a relic, but as a symbol of unity, continuity, and national purpose. While Europe industrialized through centuries of evolution, Japan did it in one generation, and Meiji, he remained quiet, stoic. Behind layers of ritual and ceremony, he rarely spoke in public, but his vision was everywhere in policy, in steel, in the thunder of factories rising from rice fields. This wasn't just a restoration, it was resurrection, and it had only just begun. In less than 2 decades, Japan transformed from a land of rice paddies and rickshaws into a nation of steam, steel, and ambition. At the heart of this transformation was Emperor Meiji, not as a tinkerer, but as a national conductor, orchestrating the Industrial Revolution on Japanese soil. The first target: transportation. In 1872, Japan opened its first railway just 18 miles between Tokyo and Yokohama. It was more than a train. It was a signal. Within a generation, that railway system exploded across the country, connecting distant provinces, accelerating trade, and shrinking time itself. Next came telegraphs, postal systems, and modern ports. Coal mines boomed, shipyards multiplied. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagasaki, once feudal cities, became engines of commerce. The Japanese government actively funded factories, built infrastructure, and trained workers in Western techniques. They even coined a term for their strategy: Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the country, strengthen the military, because modernization wasn't just about economic survival, it was about sovereignty. The samurai were gone, but Meiji needed a new kind of warrior. In 1873, Japan introduced conscription and national draft. Every able-bodied man now had a duty to the state. The military was modernized using German and French models. Uniforms changed, training professionalized, tactics updated. Naval power followed. Japan, once vulnerable to Western gunboats, now built its own. The Imperial Japanese Navy became a symbol of the country's rising might. Factories churned out rifles. Warships rolled off docks. The government encouraged zaibatsu, family-run industrial conglomerates, to take over key sectors: Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Mitsui. Japan wasn't just catching up to the West, it was outpacing expectations, and through it all, Meiji remained a steady force, silent, enigmatic, symbolic. He didn't invent the machines, but every rail laid, every ship launched, every smokestack rising against the sky, carried the weight of his reign as Japan industrialized at breakneck speed. It didn't just want to join the global powers, It wanted to compete with them under Emperor Meiji's reign. Japan's foreign policy shifted from survival to assertion. No longer content to be a passive observer of world politics, the empire began to test its strength and its neighbours. The first proving ground, China. In 1894, Japan and China clashed over influence in Korea, a strategic peninsula caught between empires. The First Sino-Japanese War was swift and decisive. Japan's modern army and navy humiliated Qing China's sinking fleets, seizing ports and shocking the West. The Treaty of Shimonoseki granted Japan Taiwan influence over Korea and an international reputation it had never held before. But Japan wasn't done. Next target, Russia. The two empires collided over Manchuria and Korea in 1904. Western observers expected Russia, a European giant, to crush the upstart Asian power. Instead, Japan launched a surprise naval assault on Port Arthur. What followed was the Russo-Japanese War, a bloody, high-tech conflict fought with trench warfare, machine guns, and naval sieges. The climax came at the Battle of Tsushima, where Japan's navy obliterated Russia's Baltic fleet. It was the first time an Asian power defeated a European empire in modern warfare, and the world noticed. Japan gained control over Korea, expanded into Manchuria, and entered the elite club of imperial powers. Western newspapers were stunned. Asian nations were inspired. The myth of European invincibility was cracked, and Japan stood at the fracture point. All of this happened under the quiet watch of Meiji, still rarely seen, still deeply symbolic. But his silence wasn't absence. It was strategy. Under Meiji, Japan went from isolation to empire, from subject to sovereign, from colonizable to colonizer, and the empire was just getting started by the early 20th century. Emperor Meiji was no longer a young revolutionary. He was a living symbol of power, of change, of Japan itself. He had ruled for decades, but Japan, once a feudal archipelago, was now an industrialized empire, with trains racing through valleys, factories belching smoke into city skies, and diplomats seated at the tables of world powers. Meiji's physical presence remained distant. He rarely appeared in public, spoke only through official proclamations, and was shrouded in rituals and mystery. But his political shadow stretched across every policy, every reform, every battle cry. In 1912, after 45 years on the throne, Emperor Meiji died. The nation paused, streets filled with silence, soldiers wept, intellectuals bowed. Because his death didn't just end a life, it ended an era. The Meiji era had become more than a historical period, it was a transformation. Japan had moved from samurai swords to factory steel, isolation to international diplomacy, feudal obedience to constitutional governance, vulnerability to dominance. Few empires in history had ever moved so fast, so completely, and yet his legacy was complicated. The same modernization that brought pride also brought imperial ambition. The army he built would one day march far beyond its shores. The factories would feed militarism. The empire would not stop at self-defense, it would hunger for dominion. But Meiji's vision was never tyranny. It was dignity, national strength to prevent humiliation, to ensure Japan could stand on its own terms. Today, his name lives on not in conquest, but in identity. The Meiji Constitution, Meiji University, Meiji Shrine, all reminders that this emperor didn't just rule, he redefined what it meant to be Japanese. By the time Emperor Meiji passed in 1912, Japan was no longer an isolated island nation. It was a modern state, a global force, a cultural paradox. Meiji had guided Japan through one of the fastest transformations in recorded history, from medieval feudalism to industrial capitalism, from Sakoku closed country to diplomatic negotiations in London, Paris, and Washington. The world took notice. In Asia, Japan became a model for modernization. Nations in China, Korea, Vietnam, and beyond looked to Meiji Japan not just with curiosity but with hope and caution. If Japan could modernize without surrendering its sovereignty, maybe they could too. In the West, Japan's victories in war and its embrace of railroads, banking, education, and constitutional law shocked European empires. No longer a curiosity, Japan was now a rival. European diplomats shifted from condescension to calculation. Treaties were renegotiated, maps were redrawn, and Japan entered the global stage not as a footnote but as a peer, but with global power came global tension. The seeds of imperialism sown in the Meiji period would grow into later militarism. The pride in national strength would evolve into dangerous nationalism. The factories and fleets built to protect sovereignty would one day drive expansion far beyond Japan's shores. Still, none of it diminishes Meiji's legacy, because Meiji didn't just change Japan. He proved to the world that a non-Western nation could modernize on its own terms, that tradition and progress could coexist, that the East could speak the language of power, not just poetry. The Meiji era wasn't perfect, but it was unprecedented, and its emperor, a silent reformer who, without shouting, reshaped a civilization and showed the 20th century that modernity didn't belong to the West alone.